Hey everyone, welcome back to Inside AutoMind. I'm your host, Dustin Andrade. Today I'm joined by Kevin Cleveland, founder and CTO of Axiom Return Solutions, a company leading the way in enterprise-grade returns and reverse logistics for Amazon sellers and a major e-commerce brands. Kevin, appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me, Dustin.
So I was checking out a little bit of Axiom's site, and it's kind of crazy how much the e-commerce world, relies on the returns side of logistics, but most people don't realize how, complex it gets behind the scenes until kind of something goes wrong on that part.
Right, exactly. And as e-commerce has scaled year over year, it's become more and more of a problem for a lot of brands and businesses that sell online. For a long time, businesses would just kind of write off issues with returns for the most part, not across the board, but especially for lower value products, they would just write off these returns as a cost of doing business. But as you continue to scale your business and you look at how much money that you potentially could be missing out on your top line revenue, it's opened the doors to more conversations around reverse logistics for e-commerce sellers for sure.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense. The bigger you get, the more you're spending, so are losing on the returns.
Right.
So let's get into, excuse me, a little about your story. So how did you first get into logistics in this space specifically, and what kind of inspired you to start Axiom Return Solution?
So a lot of it really happened organically. So my business partner and I, we both have a background in being e-commerce sellers ourselves. So we followed what's known as the online arbitrage model, where we would source products and try to resell them on all other platforms, specifically Amazon, for higher selling costs than what we bought it at. So we were able to see the issue with returns firsthand. From there, it just kind of grew organically. We originally wanted to be a prep center or, a forward logistics service provider for Amazon sellers, specifically FBA Prep Center. And we had one of our potential client reach out to us who was an overseas seller. So one of the caveats to selling on Amazon.com, which is the US-based Amazon platform, you're required to have a US-based return address for all of your products. Being that she was an international seller, she needed somewhere to send those products. A lot of prep centers will offer that as a service, but that's not really a focus of theirs. They just kind of do it as an additional service for their clients. So, but they reached out to us saying, "Hey, I have an issue. My prep center said we can no longer use their return address because it's a messy business to be in." And we said, "Hey, sure, we send it on over." And the goal there was just to take them on as a prep client. And she forwarded us pallets of inventory, valued somewhere between $10,000 to $20,000, and we reached out saying, asking this potential client saying, "Hey, what do you want us to do with all this stuff?" And she responded, "Well, historically," and take in mind, this person had been selling on Amazon as a resale for almost 20 years, back when Amazon was just books. She said, "Historically, my prep center would just ship in all the units that are still sellable, that I still have access to sell and that are worth sending back into Amazon. The rest they would, I guess, dispose of." No one actually knows what would actually happen to the inventory. So, there is probably, like I said, ten to $20,000 worth of inventory that couldn't go back into Amazon. Maybe the box had been open, the seal had been broken, or the shoes had been tried on and couldn't be sold as a new product anymore. Now, specifically with Amazon, you have the ability to, resell used goods under as a used product, but a lot of people don't go to Amazon to buy used products. Amazon's known for, "I want something new, I want it cheap, and I want it fast." Right? A lot of people want to go to other platforms, specifically eBay. We've seen most success with that would go to, find those sorts of products. We listed all those products. My background's in software engineering and software development, full stack, and with a specialty in artificial intelligence, which we'll get to that later, right? And so I leveraged that experience and knowledge, and we basically built out, a custom portal workflow SOP to efficiently handle all these returns, right? And you have to be in the logistics industry, you have to be efficient because your margins are so slim, right? Any company wants to pay as little as they can because that's their top line revenue. The more I charge, the more less they make, right? So we had to find a way to take this used inventory that's no longer holds the value of a new product and try to figure out a way to deal with it efficiently and for not a lot of money, right? So that's really how Axiom started, and from there, it was just a lot of word of mouth. A lot of these resellers, they were dealing with this on their own, or their prep center was dealing with it, or they were having a friend do it. So we found a way to do it kind of at scale efficiently, and we really that was our target demographic for the first probably year and a half of doing business, was working with a lot of these resellers. Where we started to hit some roadblocks was that we just ran into a lot of issues with listing on eBay. They kind of like, a lot of their processes are automated, so there's not really a lot of like customer support for a business like mine if I ever ran into any issues. There's just a lot of bottlenecks, and so we had to continue to increase our prices, and for a lot of people it just didn't make sense. So we really started to dial in our target demographic. Over the past year, really, we've really focused our energy on to dealing with reverse logistics for brands and agencies, right? So brands being, they own the product, they manufacture the product, they sell on Amazon or Shopify. And then agencies that basically work directly with brands on their behalf to basically manage the inventory, purchase inventory. They're the sole reseller of these products online, essentially, for the most part. So, being that we already kind of had a plug and play software and workflow, our focus over the past, 6 months to a year has been finding ways to achieve a similar goal, which is, keeping this inventory out of landfill and making it sellable condition again, at a price point that makes sense for these products, right? And that doesn't mean every product, has life after it's been returned and used. Specifically with Amazon, obviously I'll spend a lot of time talking about Amazon, because that's, the largest e-commerce platform in the world, by far. And so, and the problem with Amazon is their returns policy is wide open, right? You can buy a pair of shoes, go run a marathon, say, hey, I don't really feel like these made me run any faster, and you said these would make me, better at running, so I'm going to return them, right? So you have to find ways to, continue the life cycle of these products, and for these brands to continue to remain profitable off these items. And so we've really, honed in, custom SOPs and workflows for different kinds of products, so that we could keep our business open, but also allow businesses for it to make sense for them to use our service, right? So that's been I think the most complicated part of the whole process is, how do we achieve a price point that makes sense for us and for our clients? And the way that we've done that is we've leveraged as much technology as possible to assist us in those workflows to be efficient enough for it to make sense. But also, our goal at Axiom here is to provide a value, whether that's data, ability to track your inventory. So we're able to develop these custom branded portal build outs, custom workflows, custom SOPs for all of our clients. So I'm just kind of rambling at this point. From, from inception, man, that's kind of been our story, as we've kind of grown and tried to adapt and learn more and, push the envelope. Reverse logistics, especially, is a very messy business. For logistics, people have been doing that for a long time, and there's kind of, there's at least, there's a structure that you can build off of, right? You receive large quantities of inventory, and you fulfill the inventory, you send it into, a fulfillment center like Amazon or Walmart that, does the last mile delivery for you. But with us, there was nothing. There's not a lot. There's not a lot of people playing in the reverse logistics world. It's messy. There are businesses that exist that look at it from, at scale. They just try to liquidate, by the pallet, right? But how my business and how we compare to, like a liquidation company or people that deal with reverse logistics with that train of thought is, they're making pennies on the dollar selling these, high-end, products at, $2-3 a unit, which can make sense for some products. But a lot of those are products, they still hold value, and it still makes sense to, especially if it's just as simple as it just needs a new box. Maybe it was damaged during, the shipping process to the original customer, and the customer said, hey, this was, I don't want this because it doesn't feel new anymore, right? So we try to provide a lot of insights and consultation to our clients to provide that value. How do you, Maybe it's redeveloping your packaging, to survive shipping, so that when a customer, ends up with a product, they feel that it's a new product, so, and we can just repackage that to make it that product again. If that's all it needs is a new package or some stickers or need to be reworked in some way. So yeah, man, that's our story.
Yeah, so it sounds like, I mean, you guys are in a unique space already, but the way you guys do it is definitely different. And you guys have, seems like a much better approach to this whole situation. Well, I guess returns can, I mean, I'm sure we both agree, returns can make or break profitability for brands. I mean, we just talked about a little about how the bigger the company, the more possible loss. But what do you think most companies misunderstand about reverse logistics after you started working with more people?
It's kind of twofold, right? So you have brands and businesses that will try to handle it themselves, right? And have this feeling that keeps my costs lower by trying to find a way to deal with it myself, right? But as a e-commerce seller and having experience in that world, what my recommendation to a lot of these clients is, like, don't lose track of what's most important to you, and to an e-commerce seller or brand, what their main focus needs to be is, I need to get as much inventory manufactured, advertised, and sold as quickly as possible and efficiently as possible. But when you start to take up warehouse space, dedicate staff, then just dedicate management to try to deal with these returns, you start to take away from your ability to do that, right? And even that warehouse space alone, like recovering, profit from these returns, may net you, let's say, $100,000 over the period of a year. But if you were to allocate that warehouse space and that staff, and that time, that energy into sourcing more products or coming up with new products, having them manufactured and shipping those, into Amazon and having those fulfilled more efficiently, um, that's going to net you, 2x that, hopefully, maybe even more, right? That's where the money is to be made. And so my argument when someone says that to me is, we're hyper focused on your returns, right? So maybe our cost may be, marginally more expensive than you doing it yourself, but we're gonna provide high end returns consultation. We're gonna be able to identify why returns are happening in the first place, right? Because that's our goal, is to help our clients reduce their returns, which is bad for my business, but that's what we want to bring value to these companies, right? But we're hyper focused on that. We identify customer fraud. We're able to file reimbursements, on products, especially with Amazon. There's a lot of people that take advantage of Amazon's return policy to commit fraud. For instance, even personally, my feet are marginally two different sizes, right, by about a half an inch. In a perfect world, I would wear like a size 13 on my right foot and like a 12 and a half on my left foot. Like, that's what would be most comfortable for me. But, from a cost standpoint, it would never make sense for me to buy two pairs of shoes to achieve that. What we see time and time again is Amazon customers will order two of those different products and then put one of the 12 and a half, so they're not going to keep, and one of the size 13s, and they're not going to keep back in the box and return it as if, it wasn't their fault, right? So we're able to catch those types of fraud on file on our customers' behalf. As far as the kind of clients that we're seeing, that's one of the comments that we hear a lot is, we're just going to do it ourselves, or we're already doing it ourselves. Whereas my response to them, we're really efficient, we're hyper focused, and we have a lot of value to bring, to that. And then other things that we'll hear, is it's just not worth it. Like, I'd rather just not deal with it, think about it. And for some products, if you're selling lower value products, or specific types of products, like beauty products, for example, I wouldn't say never, because we deal with really, really large, agencies that handle, brands. Like, for instance, one of the agencies we work with just signed on Charlotte Tilbury, which is a very large makeup product. For them at scale, it makes sense. But if you're a smaller brand or a smaller, company selling beauty products, there's not really a lot of life left in those products, simply because it becomes a biohazard, right? Like, if you make a product and you open it and you take off the seal and you sniff it and you're like, I don't like the way this smells. That product is unfortunately is going to end up in a landfill. You can't resell those products. It's not safe, because sometimes it's impossible to tell that someone used this, were their hands clean when they were handling this, right? Same thing for like, like pillows, right? How can you confirm that someone didn't take this and sleep on it for a week, even though it looks new and it smells new? Maybe they had lice and they slept on it for a week. Like, I don't like it, and they return it, right? Some products, it doesn't make sense, but for most, I'd say probably, 70% of categories, it's always going to make sense. But it has to, you have to almost like qualify for this kind of service by having enough returns. Like if you're only getting a couple of returns a month, it wouldn't really make sense to work with a business like mine. It would just make sense to kind of continue to write those off until it makes sense, right? But I always suggest it's, like we have the way that we kind of handle those conversations is we try to offer a very low entry co-discovery period where you work with us for a period of time at a very low price point that allows us to, potentially identify a value that we can bring to your business and the value that as a service, and the data that we can provide or the kind of reports and workflows that we can help you develop. That's how I usually respond to those sorts of responses as someone that might think that it might not be worth it. Right. But I always think it's always worth investigating it. Right. But even that takes time, and I understand like you have a dedicated staff member or yourself as a business owner that, before we started this podcast, we're talking about that, right? It's like when you run a business, you're very busy always. There's no 5 o'clock I'm clocking out, right? So a lot of times this side of the business, it's hard to, get someone to understand why it would be important because for them, it's like, my margins are great. Why would I do that? So, you know, even if we even have some clients that really our service kind of ends up being almost a break even cost for them, but it keeps it out of the landfill, right? Like who wants your product in a landfill, right? Even if it's bringing value, that's almost free marketing, in a sense, because like you have to pay for a service such as mine to handle the returns and resell those products. But if you get a quality product in the hands of a customer, even just the word of mouth saying, "Hey, I just purchased a brand new pair of AutoMind shoes, and they're really comfortable. I got them on eBay at a stellar price," that just even that makes sense alone, even if they're not recovering a lot of profit from that. I think the value to trying to figure out a efficient way to deal with returns is necessary for, like I said, probably about 70% of categories and people that sell online. That's just my opinion. So
No, for sure. The way you explain it, it makes even more sense. Some people might not see it that way. But would you say most of those challenges are more operational or data driven, kind of at the core of it?
I would say probably both. Probably like a 50-50 split, because operationally, the especially if you're doing it yourself, right? Like to keep the margins to a point where it makes sense, you can't hire high level staff to help deal with that. If you do, then your margins on those products decrease, but the data alone, same thing, it's like, that's why we really kind of strive to provide as much data and insight as possible using, technologies and software to achieve that so that we can, my goal, and then I joke with my business partner, my goal has always been like, we want our workflows and our software, getting it to a point for every brand and agency that we work with to get it to a point where, a monkey could do it. Right. That even at some point, if the brand or agency wanted just to license our software and they can plug and play and do it themselves, that's totally fine with us. Right. But that's always our goal is to strive, for, really implementing as much technology and SOPs as possible so that anyone could just come in, Dustin, you could come to my warehouse and sit down and not even be told what to do. You just scan an item and it tells you what to do. And and we'll keep doing that until we, it's become a little bit cheaper and they'll just do all the work for us.
Yeah, that's going to be a interesting time when that happens, right? Let's talk a little bit about trends since you guys kind of are in a unique space. Do you like what trends are you noticing right now? I guess in the returns and reverse logistics,
It's only becoming more and more of an issue. There's more and more customer fraud. I think that, that's just, the more people that purchase stuff and the more that the culture is that I should, Amazon has created this culture, even if you have a Shopify store, to compete with Amazon, for D2C sales, you almost have to, match their policy, like return whatever, whenever for whenever. Right. But the trends that I'm seeing a lot of is that, the data that you get when asking a customer why you're returning a product isn't actually a valuable insight, right? People buy products, have buyer's remorse. I've even seen some D2C sites, offer that as an option for why you might want to return something. No one's going to, I think, admit to that. Maybe there's a fear of having to pay a restocking fee or, just feeling guilty for having returned the product. So we're seeing more and more of a trend of that data from the customer not really being valuable because, a lot of times they'll say this is defective, which defective is such a broad term, for different kinds of products. Like, defective laptop's going to be different than a defective pair of shoes, but, how do you, extract, you know, information from a product that's returned that's actually valuable, and that's what we're really trying to focus on. Those are just the trends that we're seeing because at a higher level, like, that's really important information. If your products are truly being returned because they're defective, you need to know that so you can talk to your manufacturer and figure out what's going on here. But without having a hands-on approach, it's impossible to really understand what's going on, and make higher level business decisions. And that's where we come in and, and try to help with that, right? That's where we're seeing, a lot of trends. Obviously, returns are increasing, they're ever increasing. I heard someone, throw out a number, I don't really think that it's tracked to this extent, but I heard someone say recently this, it's a multi-billion-dollar issue, our returns. Right. I recently heard from one of I want to say maybe I don't want to misquote, represent them, but they worked for Best Buy and they worked in the logistics side of things. They made a comment saying that they allocate over $250 million a year just trying to figure out what to how to deal with all their returns. Right. And then beyond that, it's, our landfills are filling up, with products that shouldn't be there. One of the avenues that we actually take with some of our partners is, we actually will donate a lot of stuff. If it doesn't make sense to try to rework that inventory, we'll actually donate it to someone in need. Even with the conversation about the pillows, you can't really resell those, but you can hand them out to people that are homeless, right? There's always, I think, an avenue for 70 to 80% of inventory that is returned, even if it's unsellable. I think that's the trend. I'd say more than anything is it's ever increasing. It's a more and more of a problem for anyone selling online. Well, there's no physical touch points. When you own a physical brick and mortar retail store, that product's coming back in and there's physical people to touch and deal with that inventory. That's what we do. We're those, employees in your store. They're going to figure out, how do I handle this? So that's what we're seeing, man. It's just more and more of that is, lack of information and data about returns and lack of ability to really handle that effectively.
Yeah, I like that approach because it shows that you guys aren't just about, obviously there is the side of solving a company's pain points, but then there's also the other side that you guys seem to focus on, which is great, which a lot of people would really like, is the like a sustainability and environmental part.
Right.
That's big for a lot of people also. So that's a really great thing you guys are doing. Let's talk a little bit about technology. You kind of touched on it here and there, so I'm sure there's a lot that goes into the back end of what you guys do, but let's go. I guess we like to dig more into a little, especially hot topic nowadays, of course, AI and automation. How do you see how do you see AI changing the way companies maybe manage returns? Like, I guess, predicting return rates, routing optimization, improving decision making. There's a lot of ways but what, in your opinion, what do you think as far as that?
I definitely see a world in where that can make sense, but I think before you can effectively implement artificial intelligence into any workflow, no matter what kind of business you're in, you have the input, be right. If I log into ChatGPT and just start pressing a bunch of letters on my keyboard that aren't coherent or any sort of language, it's not going to give me a valuable response, right? So similar to what we've been talking about, if I feed all this information saying, hey, 80% of my returns this past month for my product says that it was defective. How many of those were actually defective? I don't know. What is it actually going to, the input has to make sense, right? So the way we're trying to leverage with the thought process, leverage AI in our workflow is currently is what we're working on is during the inspection process, helping through machine learning, helping AI be able to assess and grade a product, right? And help make disposition decisions for those products. And why that's really important is, uh, for me as a business, when I look at my, revenue and my expenses, one of the top expenses that I have, and this goes for most businesses, employees or staff, right? So I have to hire them, which is a cost. I have to bring them in and train them, which is an additional cost. And I have to pay them to actually do the work, mistakes, which is an additional cost. That cost, right, has to be passed along to the client that they're doing work for. So our clients, they're servicing their products, inspecting, grading, reconditioning, whatever needs to happen. There's a cost associated with that, right? So for more complex products, I have to charge more money. And even, if we're backing up to what I've already discussed, like it starts to make less and less sense, because it's more cost associated with the return that may inevitably not ever have value again, right? So if 90% of your products are just basically need to end up disposed of anyways, I still am going to charge for that, right? Like we're not going to work for free. Like my staff is inspecting these products and receiving them, scanning them in, determining what's wrong with the product. Like even if you get no value back out of those products, I still have to charge you for that, right? So I think that's where AI can come into play because my cost for that part of the process at least becomes next to nothing, right? So then I can decrease my prices for, makes me more profitable because my expenses decrease on the, staffing side of things, but it decreases for my clients as well, which makes, our service make more and more sense because I'm going to charge you less for the same service rendered. So that's really my opinion, is, I think AI, and I actually studied artificial intelligence when I was in college. I graduated back in 2000 with a computer science degree. So, it's much different landscape than it was today, so to speak. A lot of, ChatGPT, it's taken so long for it to get to where it is right now, but it's existed, the actual technology has existed for quite some time, right? It's just now more consumer facing. But, I think with AI in general, especially as it applies to us, like I said, is like we have to continue to provide it valuable information. I obviously was going to reference ChatGPT because it's most well known. GPT relies on the information that's provided. If it's provided bad information, it's not going to be useful to anybody. So whenever you try to implement AI workflows, it's really, really important that you find ways to provide it with really valuable inputs, allow it to learn from, very data rich information and examples so that it can learn, right? And then it can start to make, via decision tree, start to make decisions that are actually correct.
Yeah.
I don't think we're in a world just yet where you can confidently, especially in my business, like I couldn't just connect OpenAI to my software and allow it to make decisions. Don't get me wrong. If I take a picture of a pair of shoes and upload it and say, hey, can you identify the defects? It'd probably do okay, you know? But even then I have to be able to respond to it and say when it makes a mistake so that it can continue to learn, So I think there's definitely some growth, um, in that arena for sure. I think the other way we're really trying to implement AI, which I think that this is really where I see it the most in my day-to-day life and other business utilizing it is for like customer service responses, drafting social media posts, responding to emails. I think it does that really well. And once again, as a business owner, like I no longer have to pay someone to do that, which is phenomenal. Really try to stay away from it as much as we can. We help it kind of help us draft responses or posts and stuff like that. But I think it's still really important that there's that human component, right? As a business owner, I think that's one of our top priorities is that it's we're personable, that you're talking to a real human. I don't think the desire for that's ever going to go away when you have a relationship with a client. It's really important. There's always that human component, right?
Mhm.
I wouldn't sit here and watch an AutoMind podcast if it was conducted by two AI bots that each of us created to answer these questions perfectly. It wouldn't be, there's got to be the human component, so, that's kind of a mouthful there, but that's how we're trying to implement AI into our workflow, but also some roadblocks that I see, just within the industry as a whole. It has to be, you have to provide with valuable input and data to learn and to respond correctly, you know?
No, yeah, for sure. That all makes sense, especially the last part you touched on, the human aspect. I think most, as a consumer, people would appreciate that from any business. And I feel like most businesses, as time goes on and AI kind of grows, I think the businesses that still have a focus on the human aspect and that interaction, I think they'll do better than people that try to go kind of too automated. And then but I mean, it's like, I guess a lot of people think AI is gonna replace humans, but I guess it has to be more of like a enhancing the human or the job, or the employee, versus trying to replace someone fully. I don't. Yeah, you can't really ever get rid of that human aspect.
Right. And replace humans, no, but I think that over time, as we can continue to provide more valuable inputs, it'll come close to replacing certain kinds of jobs and workflow, which makes sense. I think, which I know a lot of people get concerned about that, but I think culturally it's a good thing because it's going to push people to go try to learn more, expand their minds, and, learn a new task or try something new. There will always be the need for a human component at some level. I think full automation, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I think, definitely not in my lifetime. Because to that point, like even if I could achieve a fully automated service, where I don't have to do absolutely anything, it does the advertising, the onboarding, the processing, the fulfillment. If it did everything, I think people would like it because of the price point, but I think that nothing's absolutely perfect and nothing absolutely will ever be perfect. So it's like, you ever have an issue, I want to talk to an AI bot about it. I want to talk to a human. I want to, feel like I'm heard and validated. And, so I just think, for quite some time, I think that's just an important thing to remember, is that human component. If you're operating a business with us in logistics or elsewhere, I think it makes sense to be efficient and implement AI to make yourself more efficient and try to keep your revenue down. But like, there is just a threshold there, man. It's like, because my clients would love these sorts of implementations because it allows me to keep what I'm invoicing them monthly lower. Value of a human component, is really important. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the calling part, because I feel like now it's much more common. I'm sure you probably experienced it, but I have for sure, is when you call somewhere, it's like hard to get to an actual person. And I'm sure as the AI gets better, you're not even gonna know. Like, it's gonna say, you're gonna be like, oh, you think it's a regular person, and then you're gonna find out halfway through the conversation, somehow you're gonna be like, wait, this is not even a real person. It's gonna be an AI, and that's gonna be, interesting.
Well, we're already sort of there. I get spam
Yeah.
calls almost every day from, it's an AI generated voice, and they'll actually respond to me. Like that already exists, but
Yeah.
it's mostly fraudulent, right? It has people trying to like give me a loan, they're trying to get me to give them some information about myself so they can use against me. It sounds like a human. I mean, you can kind of still tell, but maybe for someone that's elderly, they won't be able to tell. That technology is definitely there, but to your point, like I don't think it's going to be quick enough to, because I think everyone needs something different, has a different way of wording the same question, right? It's different languages, and within that language, there's different dialects that have different meanings, so it's like I think that's just really important to be able to, get your question answered, by a human, because you're gonna be able to interpret. If you had a bad experience, I think it's important to be validated, hear a customer's concerns. If there's a potential to repair their relationship or help them figure out an issue that they're facing, I think is really important, you know? So not even
I'm
just
sure most people.
just from like a business perspective, but just as from a human perspective, I think that's really important.
Yeah, I'm sure most people would agree that human connection is a big thing. I mean, since thousands of years ago. I mean, human connection is always important. Kind of last thing on this is you. So I know you mentioned you guys are trying to build workflows and things like that using AI and automation, but are you guys is that just an experimenting, or have you guys implemented anything, or?
Nothing's implemented yet, right? Because it hasn't gotten to a place of being accurate enough to where, I feel comfortable basically turning over that work. It still requires that human component. The thing that we're exploring, is having quality control via virtual assistants, which I think is an awesome platform. Utilize virtual assistants, in third world countries, just to be able to review the work that's being done. That's kind of where we're at, but nothing actually implemented yet. It's once again, I think for me to feel confident that it's going to do the job that I want it to do, I had to provide a lot of valuable information for it to learn, right? Like if I wanted to identify, a condition of a pair of shoes, there's tools out there that already exist, but I wouldn't, as a business, I wouldn't have enough confidence in that to actually implement it. So for me to feel confident, I have to feed it over 100,000 different angles, 100,000 different images of 100,000 different pairs of shoes with multiple images along with data about that product, what the defects are. So that takes up a lot. That's a lot of time to get there, So that's what we're working on currently, is providing as much value, data rich information to feed into our tool for it to learn so they can become, more accurate. Like there's definitely like a threshold, it needs to be 80 to 90% accurate every time.
Yeah, I feel like it's going to be a while till it gets to that point. I mean, it is going pretty rapidly. Like you said, it's a lot of people don't realize that it's been around for a while, but now I guess it's more open to the public but I think, I don't know, the next 5 to 10 years probably will be really interesting when it comes to just any type of large language model, especially.
Right. Well, the reason why, it seems like it's just like, oh, wow, like this just, can't believe this is coming out of nowhere once, to my point, it's been around for a long time. The thing that's changed is for AI to be, an effective tool, you have to give it a lot of information, right? Since I, graduated college, computers are exponentially faster, right? The coding for it to learn has become exponentially, more efficient and interpretive, right? So it's able to continue to learn from itself, which is really cool, But the issue you run into is if it's wrong, it needs to be told that, because if not, it's going to continue to extrapolate that data and continue to provide wrong information, right? I love the disclaimer on the bottom of ChatGPT, like this may not be wrong. Make sure you're double checking it, right? But I think over the next 5 to 10 years, what's really going to change the game is when, I mean, I've never seen one, but, you read reports and documents about these supercomputers, that can work really, really fast. I think that's what's really going to kind of take AI to the next level, because you can feed it a lot of information really, really quickly, right? Like you think about it, like Willow, Google supercomputer, and the new benchmark that they just passed. If it could scrape, it'll be able to scrape the entire internet in like milliseconds, like less, and I think it's equivalents, right? Like not even a real time. It's, a made up time frame because it's so fast. That'll be what's interesting to me, is it'll be able to, in real time, scrape all the data that's available on the internet across the world in real time, right? That's insane to me. Like that's when it's going to, potentially change the way we live a little bit. But once again, like, it can do that. But if I, maybe I go build out, 1,000 different websites with, fake information, like how does it validate that, right? Like, and if it starts to respond to people based off of the information on my fake websites, it's just going to be providing you fake information, right? So, I think we're probably decades, maybe centuries away from providing these tools, data rich, true information and data for it to actually be feasible, right? Across the board. So, yeah, man.
Yeah, but when you really take your time, like I agree with what you're saying, and when you really take the time to kind of wrap your head around the whole computing and the way it's going, it's just an interesting time to be alive.
Yeah, for sure.
It's interesting to see what's going to happen in the near future and in our lifetime at least. But
I just my hope is, I hope we don't put the cart before the horse. right? I think people are getting really, really excited and trying to implement AI in more and more ways. But, I think that trying to do it too much too fast, once again, if it's, not accurate, it's not valuable, and it's going to cause misinformation, right? You see all these videos that it's able to generate that aren't real like that. It makes me nervous that it can, you know, cause a lot of misinformation, right? So it's actually having the opposite effect of what we want it to. That's always my concern. It's like, let's maybe slow down a little bit here. We'll make sure that it's actually accurate, right? Even in my experience, if my tool is providing my clients with fake information, they're going to be making, very expensive business decisions based off of the wrong information. Very, very costly to someone like myself and my clients, right? So it's important. Let's not put the cart before the horse, right?
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people agree. Well, there's a lot of people on the aspect of wanting to grow AI and automation, but then there's also the people that are kind of whistleblowing and saying like, "Hey, maybe we shouldn't do this so fast," But
Right. I think, I just recommend to anyone that's operating a business, like, do your research, test. Don't just, believe false claims that people make, because there's a lot of that out there too that exists. It's like, my AI tool can do anything. And a lot of people will be like, oh, cool, a lot of those tools are really cool, but, how good is it actually? It'd probably test it
yeah,
first, do a
yeah,
lot
it's
of
not
tests.
always what they promise. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, this was an awesome conversation. I appreciate you sharing your insights on, innovating in the reverse logistics space and how you guys at Axiom are helping, brands turn returns from a pain point into profits. But for anyone listening who wants to connect or learn more about you guys, where can they find you and Axiom Return Solutions online?
AxiomReturnSolutions.com. You can find us on LinkedIn, Kevin Cleveland, or my business partner, JD Sass, SASS. Feel free to reach out. We're always open to conversations. If you want to learn more, if you, potentially exist in a space where you might know someone that has a need for something like this, we're always open to, rev share deals and things like that. We're constantly kind of expanding. But Axiom Return Solution, there's a contact form, or you could just shoot us an email, info@axiomreturnsolutions.com, and we'll be more than happy just to, continue the conversation or help in any way we can.
All right, guys. Well, you heard it here. Go check them out. Again, really appreciate your time today, Kevin. And for everyone tuning in and listening, thank you for listening to AutoMind, and we'll see you next time.